So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. This is our final adult education event for the fiscal year of 2020 and 2021. We are pleased to be partnering with the Sisterhood Book Club for this event. You all know me. I'm Ann Katz, the chair of Adult Ed, and I would like to thank the Adult Ed Committee and especially Bobby Sadow, who has tirelessly put all our materials together to promote these programs, as well as being our Zoom master so we can bring them to you. Please make sure you visit Temple Beth David's website for adult education and scholar in residence programming with Rabbi Deborah Eisenman. So we have a wonderful program planned for you today with our own Temple Beth David mother and daughter duo, Elaine Fleisher and Trina Pulliam. Maybe you guys, well, your names are up there. I was going to say you should raise your hands. So Elaine was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and then moved to Beverly Hills. She graduated from the University of Miami, the one in Florida, with a BS in business before getting married in 1961. Elaine went back to school to get a master's degree in Jewish education from Hebrew College in Boston in 2005. Elaine has dedicated her life to the survival of the Jewish people and Israel. She has studied with numerous scholars on topics such as Judaism, history, politics, and the Middle East. She has been involved in some form of Jewish life since her early adulthood. She was instrumental in starting a Camp Kadima in Hollywood, Florida, and raising money for Operation Solomon, a covert Israeli military operation to airlift Ethiopian Jews from Israel from May 24th to May 25th in 1991. Elaine has been to Israel 30 times. Elaine and her husband, Marty, lived in Miami before moving to Hollywood, Florida, where they lived until 1997. And then she moved here. They raised 2 children who are dedicated to education and the state of Israel. And as I said, she currently lives in Palm Beach Gardens. So the other part of our mother-daughter duo is Trina Pulliam. She's president of Trina Visions, a 26-year-old boutique consulting firm with a team of consultants focusing on the effectiveness of nonprofits and local governments. She specializes in organizational improvement, strategic planning, and efficiency measures. Her company leads the Palm Beach chapter of Sidewalk Talk, a nonprofit community project changing the world one heart-centered conversation at a time. Safe Conversations and Sidewalk Talk teach and practice listening, empathy, and understanding, no matter the subject matter. Trina is a graduate of the University of Florida, where she studied business, finance, and economics. She has been a member of Temple Beth David for 15 years, and her son, Jesse, became a bar mitzvah here. When she is not working or volunteering, Trina can be found on the trail hiking or running. In 2019, she ran 3 ultra marathons, which are 35 miles each, I guess, which is a lot. So please welcome Elaine and Trina for a presentation and discussion based on Daniel Gordis's book, We Stand Divided, The Rift Between American Jews and Israel. It's all yours, Elaine.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming and being a part of this discussion. This book and this presentation were written in February 2020, before the major changes all over the world. I want you to keep in mind that the two subject matters that really affect the interpretation of my report are the Abraham Accords and the rising anti-Semitism in this country. The one change, in my opinion, that is relevant to the Middle East is the Iran JCPOA nuclear pact. However, I want to stick to the content of the book. We need to keep in mind these major changes, though. The book is called We Stand Divided, The Rift Between American Jews and Israel by Daniel Gordis, written in 2019. Gordis is the Carrot Distinguished Fellow at Shalem College in Jerusalem, Israel's first liberal arts college. Gordis sectioned the book into three parts: the rift, which included current and past disputes; the causes, that examine the history of the troubled relationships, including people or religion; and liberal or ethnic democracy, and a section of the future. Gordis says that the two communities must acknowledge their differences and forge a path forward. That was the purpose he wrote the book. This book brought my attention to why so many Jews are not interested in traveling to Israel, not informed on what's going on in Israel, not concerned about the political ramifications for Israel and other lesser topics of Israel interest. All these subtopics I compare to my own thinking and action in reference to Israel. Incidences in my own life struck me as, oh my gosh, is that what my Israeli friends said? Now I understand what they mean. For example, when I said in a conversation several decades ago, my Israeli friends said that I told my Israeli friends that I'm traveling back to Israel next year, as I did for 30 years after that. And they'd look at each other and say, she's a Zionist. What? What does that mean? I've never figured it out until I read this book. Israelis define themselves through their peoplehood. American Jews define themselves by their religion. Opinions of American Jews are determined by the developments and differences over what Israel does in relation to the Orthodox Jews, Palestinians, Jewish life priorities, language, and education. My purpose in reading this book and encouraging others to read it was to understand the point of view of the young millennial American Jews. They believe that Israel will exist forever. Is that what we in this Zoom room believe? We are a generation that knows the precarious existence Israel lived in the past and lives with now. If they cannot defend themselves by themselves. Relationships with Israel became much stronger after the 1967 war. Where were you? Did you hang on the TV for a few words when the half-hour news report came on? We heard Israel was attacked, but then what happened? I sat at a Jewish Federation meeting crying my eyes out with fear. On the fifth day, we American Jews heard a few leaking phrases. Israelis attacked Egyptian Air Force. Not a plane was left. Let me also bring up other dates of history that Gordis mentions that had an impact on our relationship with Israel. Ask yourself, where were you? October 6th, 1973, July 4th, 1976. Years from 1987 to 1991, the First Intifada, 2000 to 2004, the Second Intifada. Where were you? The big question is, where do millennials stand on these topics? They weren't born yet, and they didn't experience those traumatic episodes. For the millennials, our American grandchildren, Israel has always been in existence and will always be in existence. And they think Israel has to step up to the challenges within their country that American Jews see as intolerable. On page 32 to 33, the book has a survey that was done. When millennials were asked about the vulnerabilities of Israel, they think Palestinians and occupation. Even though Israel did not seek occupation and tried to end it, on page 36, the millennials and others do not identify with the attacks of rockets on Israel and the 15 seconds it takes to save themselves. The image that Gordis presents is a biblical image of the differences between American Jews and Israelis. American Jews' vision of Israel is of Isaiah, the wolf lying down with the lamb. Israeli Jews see themselves as King David battling the Philistines. According to Gordis's tensions with Zionists and American Jews, goes back to 1920 and even before 1920, back into the middle 1800s, the beginning of Zionism. Obviously, there's no nation state in Israel back then, but the Balfour Declaration was taking shape. Those Jews living in Israel and those Jews living in Europe, Herzl and others, took this document very seriously. Significant tensions began before any Palestinian issue. The Reform movement was opposed to political Zionism, with the notion that Jews are not a nation, but a religious community. Reform thinking was America is our Zion. Gordis lays out what he believes are the issues of the rift between the American Jews and those Jews living in Israel. The challenges come in where American and Israeli Jews have very different visions of what Jewishness is and how they live. Number one, dangers and causes faced by each community. Number two, opportunities seized. Number three, different visions of underlying core values of both the Israeli and American Jews. The goal of the author was to put the idea of the rift in public space, to discuss and learn and repair. In reading other observations of this issue, it became apparent to me that the topic of Israel, Palestinians, is up front. Number one, the wedge issue for younger Jewish groups, along with gun control, abortion, Black Lives Matter, and even the dispute over our political parties stand. In 2018, Pew, PEW report says that 79% of the Republicans and 29% of Democrats sympathize with Israel. Contrary to the established Jewish American community, younger generations of Jews don't make Israel their priority. The younger generations feeling about what happens in Israel/Palestinians seems at odds with their values of individual dignity, freedom, and human potential, which is at the heart of the American liberalism. On page 24, Gordis points out that from the First Intifada in 1987 until today, the Palestinian issue is what young American Jews resist. There are other issues also that make an impact, such as the reform movement's views of the wall. The passage of time since the Holocaust affects the thinking of American Jews. For American Jews, the millennial generation, Israel is not a symbol of rebirth. It's ancient history. To put it in perspective, as Gordis does, think about what the effect of the Civil War is to our generation. Young American Jews do not think about the loss of Israel or a world without Israel. There is no threat, and the threat is to the Palestinians in the millennial opinion. As Jewish American millennials see the Palestinians, they identify them with people of color in America and religious pluralism, and the younger generations adapt the notion of empathy to the Palestinians. Dr. Robert Rabiel, in very early lecture of 2020, called these people intersectionality as an aspect of social justice. His lecture opened my mind to this concept. The real issue that divides the world's two largest Jewish community is not what Israel does, but what Israel is. Going back to the why the different communities were created, examples are Zionism, how and why it was created. Is Judaism a religion or a nation? Bringing our experiences up to the current period, we see that Michael Chabon addressed in 2018 Hebrew Union College and implies the Jewish survival was not an ultimate value. Needless to say, this notion set off a topic of huge discussion within the American Jewish community, a community no longer certain that its survival matters cannot endure. On page 99, comment of J Street founder David Levy, who, when contemplating that there may never be a resolution to the conflict in Israel, said, quote, "Look, bottom line, if we're all wrong and a collective Jewish presence in the Middle East can only survive by the sword, then Israel really ain't a very good idea." We could discuss this thought process, but fortunately, Levy's statement will never come true. However, this is one of the main differences between the two communities, America and Israel. A devotion to a particular people, ethnicity, or even clan, or the alternative, which is devotion to humanity at large. Jewish tradition reflects both. However, Zionism focuses on a particular people, and American Jews are dedicated to humanity at large. On page 104, Gordis identifies another question at the heart of the American-Israel divide. Should Jews in modernity return to history or escape it? The US afforded European Jews a safe place. 1 million Israelis live in America. No military draft, no bombing of missiles, no firebombs. Israeli Jews sought to re-enter Jewish history. But now let's address current happenings. And I remind you, this goes back to early 2020. Israel is expanding their influence in all realms. They are economically stable. and have an affluent segment of the population. And Israel can defend itself by itself. America is raising its anti-Semitic head. What has arisen in Israel is the new Jew. The point of Zionism is that if people attack the Jews, it was the attackers who would now risk becoming homeless or disinherited. The days of Jewish victimhood was over. Frankly, when we hear of battles in Israel, we who sit in America must look behind the words of the news media and understand that Israel is defending itself, attempting to stop the exploding balloons in southern Israel and breaking up the tunnels that our terrorists come over the borders. Caution and specific solutions, eliminating Iranian terrorism, pushing into Syria and Lebanon is keeping the Jewish state safe, keeping Jews safe. On page 132, Gordis addresses the uprooting of the Palestinian people through the words of Benny Morris, the intellectual hero of the Israel's left. He addresses the nation of expulsion by indicating in certain conditions, expulsion is not a war crime. A society that aims to kill you leaves you with no alternative but to destroy it. When the choice is between destroying and being destroyed, it is better to destroy. This is a core difference between American Jews like David Levy of J Street and the leadership of If Not Now in demanding that Israel stop the war on Palestine and Israeli Jews, which have the priority of security and survival. Are we a people or a religion? Can we be both? There will be disagreements between the two communities. Gordis proposes that journalists, intellectuals, and public officials from both nations spend time together and get to know each other. The community on the other side of the ocean, not to convince, but rather to learn. It is understanding, not necessarily agreeing, that is crucial. The goal is building relationships and sharing the same destiny. Can we bridge the same destiny when the next generations have different concepts of the divide? Regardless, even when taking different sides of one issue, we remain one people. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Trina.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. I am not going to repeat the book review. We coordinated our information, and personality-wise, we are super different. Mom is very detail-oriented. I am not noting page numbers. I am not telling you, quotes from the book. I am much more conceptual in my approach. And so you will see a little bit of a different take on this. I want to start with 4 questions that I'm going to pose out there. If we can start a dialogue around that, then I'll hold off before I give you information. If you want to ponder those questions and then we have the dialogue after, that's fine too. But the 4 questions are really at the heart of what Daniel Gordis has to say in his book. And while we have a conversation, because I'm a facilitator by heart, my son actually continues to say, as he started in probably kindergarten at Meyer Academy, when we would have a dialogue and he would say, "Are you facilitating me?" So I am a facilitator at heart, and I want to pose a couple of guidelines that are just really good guidelines, and hopefully guidelines that we can put together for future conversations. Because if we all agree on every issue, whether it be a passionate issue or not a passionate issue, if we all agree, then we have no dialogue, because we're all just patting each other on the back and sort of agreeing on everything. So it's okay to disagree. Some of you may have listened to Mom's book review and wondered, is that her perspective? Is that Daniel Gordis's perspective? You can kind of hear that there's a lot that she agrees with what Daniel Gordis says just by her tone. And so I would offer that it's okay if you disagree. You can think of your kids and potentially your grandchildren or nieces, nephews, younger generations, and even potentially your parents, and how different they thought. And it's okay to disagree. It's not okay to be angry, to be disrespectful, to belittle, to demean. It's just simply okay to disagree. So I would leave you with what I learned from Sidewalk Talk. If you heard the intro, I'm not the chapter leader, but my company sponsors the Palm Beach chapter of Sidewalk Talk. And what they teach is be curious, not furious. So be curious, not furious, as we're potentially opening up this dialogue that may be passionate or it may not. I mean, we may get nothing, that's fine. Here are my 4 questions, having put forth those guidelines. How would you describe your relationship with Israel? How would you describe your relationship with Judaism? Does it matter if Judaism exists? And does it matter if Israel exists? And I think Gordis does a really good job of answering those questions in terms of putting forth the points for debate. He tells you his opinion in the book, but putting forth those questions. And these are at the heart of why the book was written. So I'll pause and just see if anyone has any comments. You can unmute yourself as you go. And if we have some overtalk, maybe we'll kind of raise hand type of thing. So I'll just pause. So potentially what I would ask is that you consider those 4 questions. I'll repeat them. How would you describe your relationship with Israel? How would you describe your relationship with Judaism? Does it matter if Judaism exists? And does it matter if Israel exists? So that's sort of the premise of the book. So at a really high level, the book is written in 3 parts. So the first part is the history. And he gives you tons of information around the history. His point is this: history repeats itself, and Jews are largely ignorant with respect to the larger history. You may have historical perspective around the 5 books of Moses, as an example. You may have a historical perspective on Talmudic commentary. Or you may have recent history where you understand potentially the new political accords, the Abraham Accords that have been put out there. So you may have that, but there's a whole span of history in between that he believes, by and large, Americans are, and many Jews, by the way, many secular Jews are also very ignorant of that history. And so he sort of proves that we don't know what that is. So why is that important to me? So at age 15, so you can imagine, my mom gave you some little bits and pieces of her own experience It's in 67, I was 4. So I remember 67, but I don't, and I remember her responses. I couldn't tell you what happened in that moment. I remember sitting in synagogue on High Holy Days, right around the time of, in 1973. And I remember sitting there and mom crying, just like bawling and bawling and bawling in the rabbi's synagogue. I mean, the rabbi's sermon. And I didn't know what the pieces were about. And then at age 15, I went to Israel for 3 months. I didn't just leave home and go to Israel willy-nilly. My mom wanted me to be sure that I told you I wasn't, just an incorrigible child, and I left home. I went on a program. It's an important program. It still exists today, although it exists very differently today than it did when I was 15. And I was put on this program, and I'll never forget. I can't remember ever having a conversation prior to being 15, a conversation with my father. And I had a really important conversation with my father. He said, "We're sending you to Israel, and you're going to be on your own for 3 months." And I didn't really understand this, but he said, "I only want you to get one thing out of this. If you get nothing else out of this, I want you to learn how to think." Now, of course, at 15, I walked away thinking that my father thought I was an idiot, which wasn't true. And I understood much later in life when it's one of my real memories of my first real conversations with my father. We got off the plane at what was then Lode Airport, right? We walked down a 747, if you can imagine, walking down the steps, right? And all the religious Jews kissing the ground. And here we are, a group of 20 Americans. And we're like, where's the building? Like, isn't there an airport? And there was no airport, and it was it was just a third world country, and it was horrible. The conditions were terrible for me as an American, 15-year-old American. But what I did, why this is so important to the book review, is at 15, walking between the stairs of the airport and the actual building, which they said was an airport, we were handed to put into our backpack a book called The Source. We were handed the 5 books of Moses in English version. We were handed a book called The History of the Jews. And we were told to read hundreds of pages by the next morning. And I was with one friend of mine who was just a really amazing student, and I was not. So my friend Shelley, who I was B'nai Mitzvah with, I said to her, "Can you read this and I'll read this, and then we'll tell each other." And we were up all night, and you can imagine the intense conditions that we were under. And the next day we got on a bus and we went to what was then called Tel Gezer, and we sat and we learned this is the beginning of our Jewish heritage. And we sat there. And from the 3 months, from then on out, we walked our history. Literally, we walked. We got off a bus and we walked through Israel with boiled chicken and hard-boiled eggs. It was disgusting. And why this is important is because I literally learned the entire history of Jews up until that year, which was 19 something or another, I don't know. So the first part of this is about the history, and that provided the base for me for a Jewish literacy. And Gordis calls it Jewish literacy. He says, by and large, Americans are ignorant in Jewish literacy. That's what he calls it. The second part of the book talks about the problem. Mom talked all about that. The differences between, and I want to segment this into, there's a difference between America and Israel, their ideologies, why they were started. And then there's a difference between Israeli Jews and American Jews. So my 4 questions were really around segmenting that out. So he says, the problem exists because of, and Mom used this term, not our term, Gordis's term, the Jewishness of the 2 segments. And so he points out that the decline of Jewish literacy in America is a root cause of the decline of American Jewish identity. Again, not my term, but that's what he says. He points that out, and he uses history as the debate. So he then goes on to say that this leads to the issue of the existence of Judaism and the question of survival of Judaism in America, and the state of Israel. So he puts all that together. Now, I've been to Israel not as many times as Mom, but I've probably been to Israel more than 10 times since I was 15. And you can see as an American, I can see the rise of what was a third world country when I was 15, and what Tel Aviv, if you're in Tel Aviv, you almost could not tell the difference. It looks and it feels like Manhattan. It's the same traffic, it's the same noise level, it's the same density of human beings, it's the same height. It's secular, it's completely secular. So I think there's chat, and I'm going to answer that in a second. We'll talk about that. But he says that the problem is in part American Jewish literacy, and he puts all of that together. The third part of the book, he puts forth modern solutions. Mom touched on it. I'll talk about it a little bit further. These are modern solutions, things that we need to do in the 2020s, if you will, not 1970s solutions, not 1980s solutions. So if I think back to my mom's experience, raising money to send to Israel was like the thing, like that's what you did. And we don't do that. We don't do that. They're economically sound. More Israelis have Nobel Prizes than most other countries combined. The amount of IQ supersedes almost every first world country. This is a state the size of Los Angeles, to give you a perspective. So those are the basic premise in which he talks about. I'm going to bring you to modern history. Okay, I'm going to bring you up to modern history. So we're not going to talk about 5,000 years of Jewish history. Again, that creates the Jewish literacy, but let's talk about just the modern part of it. So check this out. 135 years ago, I mean, I have an aunt that's 104, right? So a little bit before that, right? I mean, I have a living aunt that's 104 years old. A little bit before that, most of the entire world's Jewish population lived in Europe and in the Middle East. Israel didn't exist, right? So they lived in Europe and the Middle East. So today we separate that into Ashkenazi Jews, right? I relate, with that. My grandfather's from Poland. I totally relate, with that. And then we call the other Jews, the Middle Eastern Jews, we call them Mizrahi Jews. Mizrahi Jews 135 years ago came from Iran, Iraq. I have a friend of mine, if anybody knows the Sahayeks, right? They're two doctors and a real estate guy, right? My son went to school with Adam. One of my business partners is married to Charles Sahayek. They are Iraqi Jews. They speak fluent Farsi. Louise, the mom, just died. She was 99 years old. She emigrated to Israel from Iraq. So they came from those Middle East, Jordan, Yemen, they came from those Middle Eastern countries. So here's what happened. 135 years ago-ish, right? We had lots of war in the world. A lot of things were going on. There was a ton of anti-Semitism. And today, there are almost no Jews in those two regions. Relatively speaking, there are almost no Jews in those two regions. So where are they? Israel integrated and and brought them in, right? Absorbed, we call it Israeli absorption, right? So they went to absorption centers and they learned the language and they were absorbed into Israeli culture. And in America, we don't have absorption centers because you can come to America and be whoever you want. So we just integrated them. So Israel absorbed them and America integrated them. Now, this is 135 years we're talking. This is this short little span of time. Let me give you context. Forget 5,000 years of Jewish history. Let's talk about Italy. Just random country. Italy is 2,770 this year. 2,772 years old this year. There are relatively no Jews in Europe and no Jews in the Middle East, except in a state the size of Los Angeles. So Israel is 73 years old, and let's call them the startup nation. You've heard that term. It's used quite often. It's definitely the political term, right? It's the startup nation. But this is a state that was built out of World War II. This is a state that was built on the memory of the Holocaust, right? This is the memory of the Holocaust. That's what Israel was built on. I'll just use my son as an example. My son's 26. He doesn't have a memory of that. That's like someone saying to me, "Oh, do you have a memory of the Civil War?" I don't. I mean, it's just a thing, like it, right? It's a thing in history. And I grew up in South Florida where culture was, I mean, we had Haitian friends and Black friends and tons of Cuban friends. And, you know, I remember for me, when, I can't remember the year, but I know I was probably a junior in high school when we had this huge Cuban immigration in South Florida. And, you know, we had millions of Cubans now. That's the same to me in terms of the impact of my human being, right? My son doesn't have anything like that, right? My son will grow up with the biggest impact in his life was 9/11 and Black Lives Matter. That's the biggest impact on my son's life. So 240 plus years ago, an experiment was created, right? An experiment was created because people in Europe wanted to create, whether they got kicked out, depending on your perspective, they either got kicked out of Europe or they wanted to create a country where you could be free of a religious monarchy. And they called it America. So it's an experiment. This experiment is 240 plus years old. I didn't do the exact math because I'm not that detail oriented, nor does anybody care. So 73 years old is Israel. We call it the startup nation. 240 years ago, we have America. It's a big experiment. It was based on the premise that you could live without a religious monarchy and you could believe in whatever you could believe in. 100 years ago, we said, oh, it's the land of the free and you could be anything you want. And it's like land of opportunity. And so my, you know, Polish great grandparents sent their kids, right, to be American. Funny thing is, my grandmother's from Canada, so that was a whole different, you know, situation. So, so why does all this matter? I mean, I've just talked for probably 15 minutes, and why does all this matter? So we have two child countries. Italy is 2,700, almost 2,800 years old. So why does all this matter? We have two child countries. Israel, a country the size of Los Angeles, and a world leader in 73 years, a world leader in tech innovation. That's an important point. And I'll get to that in just a second. And the US is a world leader in intellectualism and financial prosperity. So you have these two models in the world, very young countries, two models who are modeling for the world these two different things for countries that are 3,000 years old. And people say, I remember when I was a kid, people would say, but Israel, there's no other country where it's just a religion, like a religion created a country. I'm sorry, that's not true. That's absolutely not true. Every religious monarchy was created for that religious monarchy. Besides that, the Vatican is its own country and still exists as the Vatican. So that's just not true. So the author believes that the fate of Judaism is at the hands of two countries, two very different ideologies, and two different belief systems, and two different decision-making methodologies. That's huge. I'll repeat that. Two countries, two ideologies, two different belief systems, and two different decision-making ideologies. The bridge is those differences. That's what the book is about. So he says, think of it this way. Both countries are based on the premise of freedom. This is what we share. We share freedom. We share safety. We share the notion of security. Both are ruled by democracies. Nationally, they are fundamentally different. Why is that? Because the US was created, right? It was created 240 years ago by Christians using a Christian Bible as their premise. You didn't have to be Roman Catholic. You didn't have to be, I don't know, whatever other Christian religions existed then. You know, today we have all kinds of different Christian, I mean, I don't know if evangelists existed 240 years ago, but we have that. So the state of Israel was created by Jews using the Hebrew Bible. So that fundamentally makes us different. The United States believes in universalism, right? That's our ideology. Commitment to all men at all times. That's a quote, by the way, why America was created. All men, all times. This freedom of anybody can come. That's true of Israel, but Israel was created with a commitment, this is a quote, the commitment to flourishing of the Jewish people. That's why Israel exists. It doesn't exist to live. The purpose of Israel isn't to live in good standing with the Palestinians. That's a necessary thing that we have to have for the flourishing of the Jewish people. We have to have that, right? So how we do that, Americans believe one thing and Israel believes something very different. So perhaps the most obvious difference is within the freedom of America lies the freedom of hatred, because we have all men, all freedom. So you can believe in neo-Nazism. That's okay with our universalistic government. That's okay. You can be an Arab Israeli inside Israel. And today there is representation. Because it's a democracy, Arabs have representation in the Knesset. By the way, in the poll that the Pew Research Institute did that Mom alluded to, that poll, most people don't know what the Knesset is. Most Americans, I'm going that young Americans do not know that the democracy is housed in the Knesset. That's what it's called in Israel. Most young Americans don't know that. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting statistic. So America, we have the freedom of hatred. So in our case, everybody on this call, what that amounts to is, and I'm not going to talk about how it amounts to hatreds of Blacks or how it amounts to the uprise. You can, I don't, uprise is probably not the right word, but the now existence of all of our political documents in Palm Beach County are available in Creole. I don't know if y'all know that. I work with local government. Everything that you can get in English, you can also get in Spanish and Creole here in Palm Beach County, because we have a huge Creole population. I'm not going to talk about Haitian hatred. This call is around Jewish hatred. So we have anti-Semitism, and it is on the rise. Not my statistic, and not going to tell you where that, all about what that comes from. But this begets the infighting among Americans. And so young Jews hate that. They don't like that. There's an infighting among people in the United States. But in the case of Israel, the infighting is very different. Now, Jews also hate the infighting in Israel, right? But it's very different. It's around, is Reform Judaism okay in Israel? Or are the Haredim, which are the ultra religious in Israel, they're called Haredim, are they allowed to rule Israel? You know, they don't, by the way, send their kids to the army. They're exempt. That's not fair, but yet it exists, right? Secular and different levels of religious Judaism send their kids to the army in Israel. So that's the difference. And just so you know, very few Haredim live in Tel Aviv. It's completely secular. It's completely and totally secular. But you can't get a cab in Jerusalem on late Friday afternoon. Forget that wherever sundown is. I mean, you've got this massive amount of people leaving the marketplace with all their goods because nothing is open. But they have food trucks in Tel Aviv. That's the infighting that exists there. So as he explains in the first third of the book, cycling back around, history repeats itself. If history repeats itself, is it important for us, American Jews, that Israel exists? And why is that for us? And the answer is, it's different for everybody. If we go back to demographics, what demographics show, Israel will be the home to 2 times the number of Jews in America by 2043. That's 20 years. In roughly 20 years, 2 times the number of total American Jews who live in Israel versus America. And remember, there's very few Jews anywhere else in the world who have no say, right? You're not going to have Italian Jews, of which maybe there are a handful. They're not going to have a say, right? So will there be pushback? How will American Jews handle, let's say, a war that's fueled and financially driven by Iranians? And by the way, where did Iranians get all their money? Well, America sent them a boatload of money. We did, a boatload of money. And so, you know, it was supposed to go to the Iranian people, but it didn't. And now, and so let me now let me put forth what Gordis says. Can American Jews live without Israel, and can Israel live without America? Right? That's his thing. So I'll give you 4 points. Although President Truman was on board in 1948, declaring Israel's independence, America was not not American Jews, America was not a supporter of Israel till the 50s. Okay, so that's an important point. Israel's first real allies were the Czechs. They sent warplanes. And whoever could fly them, there's a really great book. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a Navy pilot for Israel. And he wrote a book about the chaos that ensued. And they were like, who can fly a plane? And people who raised their hand were like, you get a jet, you get to drop bombs. Like, it was like chaos. And so those bombers were sent by the Czechs. And those Czechs were directed by Russia, which was then the USSR. And then the next country to come on board was France. So that's going back 73 years ago. As time progresses, Israel finds new allies and implicitly understands not to put all their eggs in one basket. And so this is what's going on in Israel in terms of foreign policy. Today, raise your hand if you know who Israel's greatest allies are today, besides mom. Brenda, unmute.
I think Germany.
Okay.
I was going to say Germany and Russia. I think they're working with Russia. They're working with China.
Anyone else? So Gordis talks about this in his book as he starts to sort of wind down and say, you know, that Israel has other allies besides the United States and how that's not putting all their eggs in one basket. But my real understanding of this came when I did attend a couple of lectures by Dr. Rabil, because he puts this in a world context, just from a historical perspective. And it was really great. Israel's greatest allies today are India and China. India and China are their greatest allies. They also, unknowingly to most of the world, have been working with traditional haters, or what I would call the other Arab countries. Now, the Arab countries that they have worked with for the past around 20 years are unable to actually publicize that because they'll get flack from their neighbors. So they can't do it. They're coming to the forefront now, right? Saying a little bit, right? And a lot of that has to do with North Africa. So Israel works with these countries by exporting innovation. Israel has nearly single-handedly saved several North African countries from starving of water, because Israel has the best technology in saving and converting waste. It's ultimately what is dirty water, we call it dirty water, gray water, into fresh potable water. So that's some of the things that they do. Today, those former haters are Bahrain, UAE, Sudan, Morocco. And so they innovate those, they export that innovation. So Israel's really learned not to put their eggs in one basket. Now, where does that leave American Jews? And I don't know the answer to this, but if 2 times the world's Jewry is going to live in, first of all, the state of Israel is so tiny from a landmass standpoint, they're going to overflow, right? I don't know how that's going to work, but at some point you can't keep building, up. And so can Israel live without America, and can America live without Israel? Can American Jews live in America? And what is the future of of Jewry just in and of itself? And so those are the questions that I pose to you. Gordis provides basically 2 answers. And again, I'm globalizing, not detailing. He says that like a good marriage, and he actually says this in the book, like a good marriage, you have to work at it, and you have to work at building a mutual respect. Israelis have to understand that there's infighting here, and that most American Jews aren't moving to Israel, and they're probably not even going to go to Israel. Most American Jews think Israel's too dangerous to go to. And our up and coming generations of American Jews have 0 to very little Jewish literacy, as he calls it. So Israel has to understand that exists, and they have to accept it, just like you would accept the imperfections of your spouse or partner. You just have to, or get divorced. And Gordis says, we don't really want to get divorced. That's probably not the best answer. And so he says we have to have humane and understanding of trust. So here's what he says. The humane part of this is we have to create trust, support, respect, understanding, and acceptance. And I'll leave you with this quote. If history is a predictor of the future, then Jewish life is surely fragile. Lessons in history should be the clarifying element and the ultimate decision-making factor. How would you describe your relationship with Israel? How would you describe with your relationship with Judaism? Can Israel live without Jews in America? And can Jews live without Israel? So those are the things to ponder. And I'll pause and stop. I've spoken for roughly 25 minutes. Comments? Just comments.
Yeah, I thought that was very, very, very interesting and provocative.
And on my chat, I said, a long time ago, the question was posed to me. I don't remember. I think I was still in college. Are you an American Jew or a Jewish American? And that's the question, really, is how you define yourself. Do you define yourself by history? Do you define yourself by geography? Do you define yourself by religion? And my grandfather was a Zionist speaker and fundraiser in the 30s and the 40s. And yet my father was not a Zionist, and I was not brought up as a Zionist. Where was I in 1967? I was in medical school. I don't remember anything about the 67 war. But yet Israel is important to me. Do I see myself ever moving to Israel? No, I never had any desire to move to Israel. I visited Israel, not so many times as your family, only twice. But I think it's a wonderful country, but it's their country. It's not my country. And I don't think I have a right to tell them how to make political decisions about their future. I think Gordis also made a point about defining our democracies differently. And I think you did a great job of the history of why the democracies are different. We're a liberal democracy. We're based on everyone being equal. Although actually with anti-Semitism, we're realizing everyone isn't equal. And the rewriting of looking at the Civil War and the whole slavery movement at the onset of the American democracy shows that people really were never all free in our democracy. It contrasts dramatically with Israel being defined as a Jewish nation for Jewish people to be able to run by Jews. And yet they have the dichotomy in Israel also, because there are Arab Israelis in the Knesset. And I have never solved the problem of who am I first or second, but I think it's a very, very interesting discussion. And I'm really glad that you and Elaine brought this book to us, and thank you both very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Claire.
I look at myself as a Jewish American. I wasn't born in this country. My parents had a business, and we didn't really discuss that we were Jewish. We were in Australia when I was very young, and we moved here. And so my relationship with Judaism is based on the fact that even though Australia was at the time, has a lot of freedom of religion, a lot of people didn't come to you if they knew you were Jewish. And so when we came here, and I saw the kosher signs when I came here, so to me, I am a Jewish American. And I am American, but first of all, I'm Jewish. And that's how I see myself, or my feeling of myself. And, but I'd like to discuss one thing about the millennials. Maybe our younger generation, Jewish younger generation, don't have the same feeling, because I remember when I used to go to synagogue, rabbis would discuss what was going on and have an opinion, and whether you, and it's sort of a discussion, and we don't get that anymore in our synagogues. If you go to a Chabad, it's basically on Talmud and the study of Judaism, and you're not discussing what is really, they'll cross over it and say, we were there and this, but it's all based back on the religion. And I feel that we need to maybe open up a little more interest for the young people, that when they are in a synagogue, that we are discussing a problem that is not just in Israel, but a problem that's here in the United States because of who we are. And so that's my opinion.
Thank you, Claire. That's a fantastic perspective. And thank you for telling us a little bit about yourself along with your opinion. And I think that I have two comments around that, and then see if anyone has any comments around that. One is, it's really hard today to disagree. And so allowing the JCC, the Meyer Academy, our synagogues, JCRC, to really open up those conversations is really hard, because we don't have so much respect for a disagreement. And that just makes it hard to have those conversations. On the flip side, I not only facilitate those conversations, but I also am grateful for APAC, which is probably one of the better examples of being able to politically discuss on both sides of the aisle the one thing that we want, and that is the continuation of we being APAC people, the continuation of the existence of the state of Israel. And so it's an interesting thing to continue to think about. And my professional opinion is that the root cause of us not discussing that anymore in synagogues, DJ, Meyer, JCRC, et cetera, is because we can't have those discussions with a healthy outlook. So thank you for that. Arlene.
I want to go back to what Phyllis initially raised about whether she's a Jewish American or an American Jew, and the conundrum that presents, because I can think of myself as an American and as a Jew, and I don't feel the necessity to make one a noun and one an adjective.
Oh, that's a great point. Oh, thank you. That's a really
You're welcome. And thank you both for this discussion. I'm going to have to go in a few minutes because I have an 11:30 engagement with my grandchildren, but this was great.
Yay. Yes, I don't know your name.
Susan.
Susan.
Can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. When you talk about growing up, I remember growing up in the 1950s, when every year, my father, who was very involved in Jewish organizations, would have State of Israel bond functions at our house. We'd get 20 people and we'd raise money for Israel. And we had one at our house years and years ago from Temple Beth David. But that same support for Israel, I don't think exists anymore. And financially, Israel is so, fantastic. As you say, technology is there. They don't need us, but they do need us. Obviously, they do need our support. And the other point was, I think that the support is coming from young people, because I know of so many, the younger generation who are graduating the Meyer, the Jewish academies, and taking a year off before they begin their college education, their higher education, and going to Israel and doing Aliyah. And some of them stay there. They stay there, and I have a daughter-in-law whose niece is now served in the army. She was born in Israel, so she has dual citizenship, and she is going to medical school there and probably staying there. Has two brothers who graduated the Jewish Academy in New Jersey, New York area, Muncie area. And of course, they grew up Orthodox, but they too, one wants to go into politics in Israel. So I think there is some hope. I don't think it's all negative. I think there is some hope for that generation. And we're talking about the generation of the 20-year-olds, that once they go to Israel, they have that sense of identity. Of course, they grew up with it. It's not the same for us who go to the secular schools. We don't have the same feelings. I feel like I'm so connected to the synagogue, and I have always been, But my connection to Israel is, yes, it's there. I visited once with the temple group. I would like to go back. But when you say that fear of visiting, that fear is in me. I admit to it, that I don't want to be on a bus and suddenly the bus blows up.
And we don't want you to be.
Right. And it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that way because it's a beautiful country and we should feel free to go there. We should have that freedom in our minds to feel safe. And we're probably safer there than we are in the United States right now. I'm safer there than I am riding my bike. I should be in Israel.
Well, that's probably true. But I will comment very, very quickly, and I will say congratulations and kudos to you. And so fantastic that you have family members who are in that younger generation who identify with their Judaism and the state of Israel. I will, just to put things in perspective, there are 80 million millennials in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So I would say that your experience is probably the exception rather than the norm. And again, I'm, you're so fortunate to have that. I mean, I don't have family members that I can say that about, but the friend that I've had since I was 7 years old, who I went to Israel with at 15, we were B'nai Mitzvah together. She married an Israeli, became Orthodox, and all of her sons, all of her sons have served in the Israeli army. They're not Israel. I mean, they have dual citizenship, but they live in New York and they don't have any plans to move to Israel. And her husband either, her ex-husband now, but
they came back to America and they have a stronger identity with Israel as a homeland.
That's right. And I would say that that's probably the exception rather than the norm. And I'm so fortunate, to still be friends with her and see her kids have that experience. And if she says to me, well, what about Jesse? My son has been to Israel. My son's probably been to Israel 6 times. Why doesn't he go and serve in the IDF? But I would say, oh my, no way. Right. I mean, I don't want you to blow up on a bus. I certainly don't want him to have a gun. Right? So there's some definite dichotomies and we struggle. There's no doubt that we struggle. Thank you for your comments. Someone else had a hand up.
Thank you.
Fran, unmute yourself, please.
Thank you so much. I have to say it's been wonderful listening to the both of you from everything that you've had to say. And thank you very much. I also want to know that since 2012, I've known about the author as Danny Gordis, because my daughter went in 2012 on JLI, Jewish Leadership Institute, and he was one of their instructors. And she said he taught every day about Jewish traditions and values. And she said another course too, but she forgot the name of it. So once it was the both of you and reading this book, and Danny is the author, I really needed to participate. But also I agree with what you said about respect, where that could cause a differential in people's beliefs of what's important, because in the very beginning of the book, I was reading about how there's a problem when, the wall was always male on one side, women on the other. I never knew until I read this book about that portion that's supposed to be equal, that everyone can go together, the women and the men, and it was going to be approved and it wasn't going to be approved. You're a guest in a country where you go to learn about something and to see how your traditions began. You respect what they do. That's just, I'm sure I'm going to hear a lot of negatives about that, but you respect what you do when you're someplace else. I don't think it's that important for the 1 time or 2 times that someone's going to be there. A lady has to be next to a man. But
so whether I agree with you or not, I think that if people disagree with you, hopefully they do it in a way that is respectful and supports you as a fellow Jew that lives in America and someone who is intellectually competent to have that conversation. But it also shows just that Jews argue. That's what we do. We have it in our DNA. You know, we argue about stuff. We argue, you know, about Talmud and interpretations, and you know, it's kind of just you know, what we do. And so
right.
hopefully if you get a comment because you said this out loud in a public forum, hopefully if you get a disagreement, people do it in a respectful way. And I will also say that I don't think people intentionally come to the table to be disrespectful. I think that they just don't know that they are. And it's for us to kind of, you know, call it out and say, you know, hey, that tone is a little forceful, or hey, you know, can we not yell at each other? Can we just have a, you know, kind of a conversational tone?
Right.
And
right. And also what you said for me was enlightening today, that things can't be discussed as openly as they had in the past because it's not correct to do. When you were saying at the end, you can't talk about certain things, whether it's at the JCC or the temple or in a learning avenue, even, because someone might say something that's going to cause a problem for somebody else. But doesn't that limit education and what people can learn?
So thank you for posing that. Let me clarify. I didn't say that that we couldn't do it because it's not correct. I said we couldn't do it because it's hard.
Right. So, but it limits the amount of education people can grow in their minds because for that reason.
So it's, you know, again, using my work as an example, and my work is a small consulting firm, and all I work with are nonprofits and government, local government. To give you an example, town of Jupiter, Palm Beach County, city of Fort Lauderdale, these are my clients. And so as I look at within their world of work, how limiting they've made their culture. You can't talk about this, you can't talk about that. If you say this, I'm going to HR. And if that's a microcosm of the rest of our culture, then we do limit conversation, and limiting conversation creates homogenized society. And I don't think we, you know, as we move to a homogenized society, the rule becomes he who speaks the loudest wins. And in this case, using simple examples of a group tried to abduct the governor of Michigan, right? He who speaks the loudest gets it's rule by squeaky wheel is what we call it. And so rule by squeaky wheel exists when we have homogenized society, and limiting that dialogue is what happens. So if we truly live in freedom, then we have freedom to live in a country with moral and ethical behavior. And that moral and ethical behavior translates into respect and support and understanding, true listening to understand different ideologies and different thought processes, and be curious, not furious.
And it helps people learn so they can understand, so they can live with others at the same time and learn more about what they need to know. How's that to say? You know?
Or just what they need to consider. At the end of the conversation, I may not ever change my mind. But if I go into it going, well, let me just consider what Fern had to say, then
it expands your knowledge, right?
And I still may disagree, and that's okay.
Right. I don't know if this is going to be okay to say, but it concerned me when you said about the age group of the children who don't know what the Knesset is. I used to teach Hebrew school, and I always taught a lesson on Israel. That should really be part of the lesson on Israel in a Hebrew school. Or I could be wrong, but that was just what I took from that statement that you said.
Again, that's a Pew Research study. Before I comment, Susan had her hand up.
Oh, it's me. No,
I'm sorry, I'm mixing up your names, sorry.
I'm Phyllis.
Larry's iPad.
Yeah, it's not really surprising that most American Jews of a certain age don't know what the Knesset is, because if people in the United States, if young people, millennials, are asked how many legislative branches we have in Congress, a lot of them don't know that we have two. So our educational system stinks on many levels. And education, the more educated you are, the more tolerant you are of differences and the more willing you are to discuss ideas.
Phyllis, I'm going to say about this almost the same thing, because the American children, American people, shouldn't even say children, do not know about our political system. So I'm not surprised.
Right. Again, I don't disagree with you. It's just not what the book was about.
Yeah, I know. But I'm just answering Fern. But thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you know what? It was 1980 and 1981 when the Mariels came into Miami.
That's it.
Because it was my cousin's bar mitzvah in 1980, and my parents were on my cousin's boat. After the bar mitzvah, they went on the boat, and there was a great big boat coming next to them. And he goes, very sarcastically, he said, "Oh my God, I think a bunch of Cubans are coming." And like all of a sudden the Coast Guard was all around them. And I moved down to Miami in the Kensal section in 1981. And it was becoming where you say about the signs have to be in English, Spanish, and Creole. The biggest problem in that time was the Spanish who didn't want to learn English and wanted everything in Spanish. And in those days, a lot of the legislature said, if you're coming, you should learn English. So please, we're going to have the signs in English.
So funny you should mention that, because I will tell you that having Palm Beach County is the most north I've ever lived. And so having been born and raised here, I will tell you, going back to Miami today,
oh yeah,
there are places, huge areas of Miami-Dade County where no English is spoken, no English is understood, and no signs or pamphlets or anything are in English.
I can believe it. I was living there for 15 years, and it got to where when the people who offered the samples in the stores would come up to you, and they would come up to me and start speaking first in Spanish, and I would say, "I don't know what you're saying," and then they go into English. But first they spoke to me in Spanish.
Oh, and that there are examples of that all around the world. So if you go to Montreal as an English-speaking American, if you don't start in French, they do not address you.
My son-in-law is from Montreal, but what's wonderful is he speaks the French, so we can do anything we want.
Other comments? Brenda. Brenda.
First of all, I want to thank you both. This was absolutely an excellent book review. I'm not surprised knowing Elaine and now you, Trina. Thank you so much. I want to say in answer to your 4 questions, I have to say that as a Jewish American or an American Jew, I'm very proud of the existence of Israel and always will be. And I've tried throughout my life, even though it's been ups and downs, to make sure that my children had the opportunity to visit Israel multiple times. I sent them before myself because I just felt that they needed to understand what it was all about and to initiate their love of Israel. And they did all attend Jewish day schools, but I felt that being on site would just really firm up their feeling for the state of Israel. Thank you both again.
Thank you for your comment. Mom, did you have a final comment?
I just wanted to make a statement or two. The program that Trina was on was called High School in Israel. It doesn't exist as a separate entity anymore in Israel. It's under the Jewish National Fund. And I'm sure all of you know that the Picuses are very deeply involved in the Jewish National Fund. But the High School in Israel was the program, is the program, it still exists. It's an absolutely fabulous program.
although they don't have to live in barracks like we did and eat boiled chicken.
It's down in Beersheba now.
Other comments before we turn it back to Anne? Anne, we'll turn it back to you.
Sure. Thank you both, Elaine and Trina. This was fascinating. I'm so moved by the information shared, the discussion. I really appreciate your taking the time and putting together this presentation and sharing it with us. For those of you who are on the call, please go to our website, templebethdavidfl for Florida.org, to listen to any of the past adult education programs you might have missed. And if you would like to rehear what Elaine and Trina had to say today, it will also be posted in a few days. As a reminder, our Scholar in Residence program with Rabbi Deborah Eisenman will not be on this Monday, but will be on Monday the 15th at 1 o'clock. And Bobby puts that out in the constant comment, so you'll be able to just hook into that. And the topic is Happiness the Jewish Way. One other thing that Sisterhood is doing a Passover Seder. They're promoting it. Actually, Cantor Daniel Ben-Simon is doing the Seder on Monday, March 15th. So if you haven't signed up and you're able to sign up, please do so. And again, you can do that on through Temple Beth David. So this is our final adult ed for this year. And we've had such varied and beautiful programs, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Stay safe, be well, and until we see each other again, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine. It's so beautiful to see you, and thank you so much, Trina. You guys were wonderful.
Thank you.
Everyone have a nice afternoon.
All right.
Thanks, Bobby.
Thank you.